least this is what I was trying to do in Georgia. I wasn't successful, so maybe it's not great. But maybe to get at the sort of politics of memorial sites by taking one that students don't have a big emotional stake in, like the Alamo. And then once you've done that, to then analyze this 9/11 memorial once it gets up.
What book is that from, John?
Yeah, who's the scholar that you...
Daniel Walkowitz.
Walkowitz?
Walkowitz, yeah. I can get you the citation on the book. We can send it to you by email too. I'll be sure. It's a very useful one.
I'm struck by the extreme difficulty of making memorials of any kind valuable in terms of building bridges and reconciliation.
Mm-hmm.
I've got involved with a memorial in Srebrenica in Bosnia, because I did a long film about the Srebrenica massacre. And they have built a massive, massive memorial centre in the deserted old factory where the Dutch battalion were billeted, who were supposed to protect Srebrenica from what happened. And across the road is an enormous Muslim graveyard with now about 3,500 of the victims of Srebrenica massacre buried in there. And it has become a place of pilgrimage, of course, for the families and for Muslims from all over the world. But at the same time, the little town of Srebrenica, 3 miles up the road, which is an entirely Serb place, is absolutely incandescent about this. Mm-hmm. And if anything, and they say, where's our graveyard to our, where are deserving dead? And it's this polarized opinions rather than in any way improving the situation. Mm-hmm. It's a marvelous initiative, but it's not doing a whole lot for local relations.
Yeah, I would just add that, thinking about the Vietnam Memorial, which I think is wonderful, right? I have sort of implanted in my brain the 58,000 figure of Americans died, whereas the Vietnamese are just, I still, when I teach it, I always have to go look it up and think about it, because it's not really part of what's memorialized. There are millions of Vietnamese who died. So there's a way in which, that's, again, where what I started off with, this idea of, sort of nationalism as a kind of a barrier to understanding. I think that's, sort of an example of that, where, you're not going to be thinking about this in terms of it being a global tragedy, but rather an American tragedy. So all those names are American names.
Back to the different view of the Israeli situation. Now, my wife's mother was British, so we were over there a lot. And we were in London when some incident happened in the West Bank. I remember it had to do with Ramallah. And over again, the British TV showed the destruction of, we thought, buildings in Ramallah. When we got home, we saw that it was one building. It was Arafat's home in Ramallah that had been destroyed. But we never, in London, we never saw that context at all.
That's shocking. Huh? That's outrageous.
But my point is,
I mean, the guys ought to have been sacked.
to help people understand what's happening. First, get your facts right. Make sure you have the facts right before you then start to draw broader implications.
Yeah.
I just had a brief comment, just going back to the memorial and construction of the memorial, and thinking about what gets included, what doesn't get included. And in my mind, I'm thinking, I have to go back and now double check because I can't remember, can't name the people who's making these decisions, right? Who's on the commission? Who actually wrote the 9/11 commission? I'm trying to go back and think, who were the actors who are making the choices of what gets included, what doesn't get included? And I think with students, especially with maybe upperclassmen and women, higher age students, these kinds of conversations can be really fruitful as well. That history or current events or whatever it is not, it doesn't just happen, but it is a direct result of the actions and the choices that people make. And something like a memorial, the construction of a memorial, who has the power to create that permanent monument to that moment in time? I know that Facing History and Ourselves, they do a lot about memory and how do events get remembered. And just thinking about an assignment that I also do with seniors, they go to the Battery Park City Holocaust Museum, and it's not about the content, it's about the construct of the memorial. what is the layout, what is the material that's used, what is the lighting that's used, things like that to convey tone and really emphasize how that shapes our understanding. So just more comment on that.
Yeah, no, I think that's great and an excellent way to go about it. And what gets commemorated, right? What events get memorialized and what events are gone, right?
And who has the power to make those choices?
Yeah, and how those choices get made and the political pressures involved. One thing that's always struck me, I don't know if any of you have been to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial on the Mall, right? But it's been many years since I was there, but I was extremely struck just walking into the lobby, the entrance, and there's a quotation from Dwight Eisenhower. I thought, Dwight Eisenhower? I mean, of course, he was the commander of Allied forces in the West, I understand. But, I mean, clearly this was there to Americanize this, right? It's on the wall.
Absolutely.
The United States was neither the victim nor the perpetrator. So there are questions about, what it's doing there and what that means, and that's something you can talk about. Why does the United States have this in its central place for memorials, museums? So there's that kind of question. And then a quote from Dwight Eisenhower, who was peripherally involved in any of this, in some sense. Right? And that raises questions. So then, how is this being framed? What's the effort to make this seem as it's part of our history? And of course, it's become part of our history, right? And that's also a process of the last 4 decades or so, right? And then we need to understand, and then what lessons get drawn from this, and how is it framed? So it's all by way of saying, I think that's a very useful point.
There's actually a book about that very issue, about the construction of the museum and the role of memory and the political conflicts that went into it. So Sandra, I actually have the book. So yeah, because we took our students with that very lens to Washington. So, John.
Okay, yeah, I just want to ask, there's 9/11 causes and consequences and so forth, and we haven't yet gotten to the point where we can have any revisionist history of this event. We're too close to it. But incorporating we don't really talk about incorporating anything about the Arab Spring in terms of how we're going to look back on 9/11 and its consequences, and nor do I really hear anybody trying to put these things together too much. But do any of you have any thoughts of future events and how they may impact on how we'll look back and interpret?
Sure. Well, I'm a historian, so I predict the past. In 20 years, I'll tell you why it happened, how it happened. That's as far as I get. I'm not sure I agree with you, because I think there's a lot of, I don't know if revisionist literature is the right way, but thanks in part to the web, but more broadly, I mean, a lot of scholarly work, there's stuff out there that puts 9/11 in much broader contexts and makes sense of it. So the material is there. And as I tried to suggest earlier, in a way, the uprisings of last year, have demonstrated, both the increasing marginality of this movement, right, of bin Laden's project, which he hoped would appeal to these very broad masses, which exploited authentic grievances, and ultimately, I think, was rejected by the vast majority, from the start by the majority, but more conclusively in recent years by the vast majority of Muslims and of Arabs in particular. And we can see the Arab uprisings as, in a way, a response to that. Again, Islam was not a central slogan of those people pouring into the streets. It was very much things which made the people in Wisconsin in those same weeks very happy. Right? It was about freedom, of democracy, rights, dignity, civic involvement, things which are very familiar to us, right? And even though, and of course it gets more complicated, and this is a political issue in this country, Islamist forces, the Muslim Brothers in Egypt, right, in a similar kind of political organization in Tunisia, have won the first free elections, which again one can make sense of given the history. This was the most organized force. They had a very long record of opposition to and persecution by the old regime, right? So they won those first elections. But even those, right? The president of Egypt got his PhD from the University of Southern California and then taught at Cal State Northridge, right, for a couple of years, right? A couple of his children are American citizens, right? This is a movement that, again, I'm not a big fan of the Muslim Brothers, so don't get me wrong. But we need to, make these subtle distinctions. Just as we can, make the distinctions among, Christian Democrats in Europe who, or, various groups in the United States. This is, a complex phenomenon. And, these groups have to be understood in their local context, and we can then see how, again, this is a repudiation of bin Laden, and that kind of approach, even though, again, a lot of Egyptians are not thrilled with the United States. Although a lot of those people attacking the U.S. Embassy were not religious guys, they were young football fans who love fighting the police. They hate the police, and the police hate them, and they've been fighting the police for 20 years at football matches, right, at soccer matches, and they hold the police responsible for letting that 75 or so people be killed in Port Said last year because of inadequate security, and they feel the police actually let this happen because they hate the ultras, so to speak. It's like the British football. These are like the British football guys. They're the Turkish. They're pretty crazy. So this is a great moment. You can fight the police, great, and you can do it, in some wider context. So this stuff, it's out there. I think there's a lot of excellent work, very, very subtle on all these kinds of things, very nuanced, and much of it very accessible, I think, to audiences. To high school audiences, maybe even younger students, need sometimes with some adaptation.
But I just want to add that one last thing is that I do think, though, maybe the perception about it that it's not available is because of, at least the way I see the media, that when you see the media discussing the Middle East, it's usually one reporter talking to another reporter, or interviewing somebody who's in the administration, doesn't read Arabic, and there's a way in which, at least my perception is that people who are really knowledgeable about the Middle East don't really get put onto television very much. And so you might think there's no alternative, but actually in academia, if you read the journals, it's filled with the alternative perspective, but it's just sort of not in the media frame, I think. That's my perception.
I think you're right. It's just judged too complicated.
Yeah.
I wanted to add one thing, just about Joan, kind of getting a little bit at your question, but I think it's important to remember that while for Americans, 9/11 was an important day and a traumatic day for much of the world, I think, and I think everyone sort of thinks about the day, but for us it looms much larger, and I think than it does for Egyptians in the streets of Cairo protesting. And that's not to say that it's not important, but for them I would say that the view of history is much longer, and that the issues that sort of come into focus for us with 9/11 were already in the minds of people. So I just kind of, I don't know, remembering that day isn't, it becomes the hub for us, but isn't necessarily the hub in terms of world history. I think it's just important to revisit. So linking so clearly between the uprisings and 9/11, I think doesn't happen a lot when in that clear way that I think Zach has said very eloquently. We can look at it as a kind of denial of Osama bin Laden's philosophies. But
it's interesting that Britain, I suppose, which is more likely to be understanding of the agonies of 9/11 than most other places in the world, I think people, even those who are were most devastated by the events of 9/11, struggle to understand how huge it has been in the American psyche.
Yeah.
There is, that we will find people who will say, it was appalling, indescribable, unimaginable, but it was less than 3,000 people. Why is there this massive focus on this? And these are not people who are unfriendly or unsympathetic towards American concerns, but there is a genuine feeling of we're puzzled by the enormity of this event. And I try to suggest to friends that a country which had seen itself safe behind two mighty oceans forever, many of whom citizens came from fear and terror in the old world, to be assaulted like this in the heartland is traumatizing at a level that we can't even begin to understand in Europe. But it isn't understood, I don't think, widely.
Oh, by the way, in terms of I just wanted to add on, in terms of polling data, this study asked, this is about 5 years ago, they asked about adults, what's the single most important, most significant event that has happened in your lifetimes in terms of its importance to the U.S. and the world? They asked Americans that. 2% named the collapse of communism, 3% cited the Vietnam War, 6% named the Iraq War. Only one event elicited substantial agreement among respondents. Fully 46% of those polled cited the attacks of September 11th
Wow,
as the most significant occurrence in their lifetime.
that's fascinating. That's absolutely extraordinary.
Yeah. And I think it's related to what you're saying. It's sort of about what happened to, because I think it's seen as an event that happened to us rather than some war overseas.
Yeah. Oh, that is fascinating.
I think we actually need to come to a close for lunch. We're going to continue this conversation after lunch. We'll do so back down here at 1 o'clock. And can we just take a moment to thank the panelists?
Yeah.